So globalism has absolutely impacted every single organization in the Fortune 500, the Fortune 1000, and even down to the organization that is only 50 people or 100 people. However, the biggest challenge has been for some organizations that have done extremely well domestically to actually branch out and embrace a whole new pool of consumers that are out there on a global basis. And that requires acting and thinking differently. It also requires leading differently. The old model used to be that organizations would send their top leadership talent off into a rotation. They'd transplant them into a country and then try to bring that company's culture to that country. And the truth is that sometimes that actually worked pretty well, and in other cases it was a really terrible implementation. And in a lot of cases it was the middle of the road, right? So they did a great job of seeding the culture, but what they didn't do is bring any of the country's culture back in, which is not a good thing when you're trying to be appealing to multiple consumers around the world. You really need to be reflective about who it is that you're serving. So it's not true that you have a one-size-fits-all for organizations in terms of how they figure this out. Right Management did some research in 2012 around what really can help make this an effective approach for an organization. We said, really, globalism is something that is led. So the question is, what kind of leadership makes for effective global leadership, especially for those organizations that are trying to make the transformation from, hey, we've been really successful domestically, now we need to be, focused on these emerging markets and developing markets in a completely different way. So when we think about that, we think about a different kind of leader. So we are seeing definitely more national types of leaders versus, say, transplants, although we certainly see some of those as well. But it comes down to a few things. One has to do with their ability to build networks in the countries in which they're functioning. So can they build the relationships internationally and within the country that they're in today, so that they bring in the right blend of the specific culture, but also they're bringing the culture of that country back into the organization, again, to be properly reflective of consumers. How well can they drive results and build teams that are able to drive results? And in fact, when you think about that, the fact that many of your teams may be international in focus, so not necessarily just sitting inside of one country, this means they have to be able to build fast and virtual trust. It means they have to be highly collaborative, highly relational, and very respectful of different cultures and different ways of looking at things and different kinds of problem solving. And this is where a lot of companies founder, because in some companies, the organizational culture trumps that cultural sensitivity, where folks will come in and say, well, there is one way to solve this problem. And that is how they have gotten around the issue of a globalized culture. They've said, well, instead of worrying about that, we'll have one way of doing it. The problem is, oftentimes they find that they're breaking their people by doing that. They will run into higher levels of attrition, or worse yet, they'll miss out on some really key innovations because their one way of solving doesn't allow everybody to show up. For instance, they might be a high talker kind of culture in a low talker kind of country. And so the best ideas really don't come forward. Leaders have to be extremely sensitive to those kinds of nuances, because you don't want to subordinate the organizational culture to a specific country culture. You need to be global, but you also have to make sure that individuals can really show up and succeed. So the way Manpower took its journey from being what was effectively a very large confederation of national organizations to being a truly global company is a really interesting example, I think. Especially since over the last 10 years is when we really made headway in the journey. We thought of ourselves and described ourselves as a global organization because we were in many different countries. But when it really came down to it, we didn't have the kind of global outlook that we wanted to have. We still came across as being extremely local. And we wanted to make sure that we preserved the good things in that approach. There are wonderful things about being local to the places that you serve. We're the global labor market experts, but that global labor market expertise is built up from being experts in local labor markets. But we also needed leadership to take a global perspective in terms of how they work together to solve really big problems. So, for example, we took in 2008, 2009, 2010, we helped our leaders take a global journey, and we had the top 140 executives in our organization work on some extremely tough problems the organization was facing. This work required them to transcend geography boundaries, communication boundaries, and since everybody was expected to show up extremely well, everybody had to learn how to cooperate, respect different communication styles, and understand that there is a manpower way of doing things that also invites the local nature to show up as well. Where we are today is this wonderful harmony between being very locally relevant, but having a really clear global voice and global perspective on the issues that matter as it relates to workforce solutions.